All right, so while it now feels like it was ages ago, only 3.5 months have passed since Justice Antonin Scalia unexpectedly died during a hunting trip in Texas. What has followed, however, is not unexpected at all. Politicians across the country are engaging in a struggle over if President Obama, or our next president who is going to take office in 2017, has the authority to have their chosen Supreme Court nominee confirmed by the Senate. But this struggle over empty judicial seats does not stop at the top of the judicial hierarchy. There are many, many more vacancies at all levels of the federal courts that are also pending the advice and consent of the Senate. Today, I'm going to walk you through the shock of Scalia's death, why we have so much of a presence of Scalia's death over our social media channels, over our news media, and I'm also going to talk about the battle for his seat. I'm also going to provide some more context for the consequences of not only Scalia's vacancy, but for vacancies that are at all levels of our federal judicial branch. So why were we shocked about Scalia's death? So to put it simply, Supreme Court justices just don't die in office anymore. In fact, it's very rare for prominent political figures to die in office at all in our modern era. Arguably, the last major in-office death of a political figure was that of Ted Kennedy, the Lion of the Senate, who was the 4th longest serving senator. And that was, does anybody have a sense of when that happened, when Ted Kennedy died? Suzanne John. In 2009, right? So Ted Kennedy died in August of 2009, which is almost 7 years ago, right? So it's been a 7-year gap since we've had a major in-office death at all. And for the Supreme Court, the last death in office was, it was Chief Justice William Rehnquist, and that was all the way back in 2005, which is more than 10 years ago. And death in office for the Supreme Court is so rare that the last death that happened before Chief Justice William Rehnquist was back in 1954 when Robert Jackson died in office during the Eisenhower administration. So the rarity of Supreme Court justices dying in office is kind of a new or modern phenomenon. And there are 2 reasons why. One is because life expectancy of humans has gone up since the 1780s, surprise, surprise. But also, there are a lot of incentives for Supreme Court justices to retire because they have really cushy pension plans that sort of encourage them to retire instead of die on the bench. So what I want you to focus on in this graph is these top 2 lines here, which are sort of going to demonstrate this effect, right? So you see sort of before the 1900s, the distance between death and age of departure at the Supreme Court is a very small gap, which means you have more members of the Supreme Court dying in office, but that gap is going to increase as we come into the modern times because Supreme Court justices want to enjoy retirement, so they will retire and then die when they are out of office. All right, so in spite of the rarity of dying in office, the Supreme Court justices like Scalia are more likely to die in office during the term of a president who is of the opposite party of that justice. And they might be doing this because there's a strategic reason why you would want to retire during the presidency of a president who has the same political inclinations as you do. But the evidence about this strategic retirement behavior in the political science literature is mixed at best. So if we want to go back to the Scalia story and why we're sort of seeing a holdup in this nominations process, while death is a rare thing for the Supreme Court, judicial vacancies in general are not rare things. In fact, President Obama has filled vacancies on par with many modern two-term presidents, with over 320 successful judicial appointments over his 8 years in office. But the majority of Obama's successful nominations have happened when the Senate is also a majority Democrat, right? So if you are the president, it's going to be much easier for you to get your nominees through the Senate if the Senate is on your side. But as national politics becomes more divisive, it becomes more difficult for a president to be successful in shepherding his desired nominee through the process if the Senate is of the opposite political party. And the effect of the partisan divide, especially for this particular case of Justice Scalia, might be amplified because this year, as we all perhaps know, it's a particularly contentious presidential election cycle. So the president is having a particularly difficult time in getting his nominees out of the Senate. Some scholars and pundits are also going to say that this sense of political divisiveness is also extending to the Supreme Court itself. So while we might have a sense of what justices are going to lean liberal or conservative in their decision-making, we've never seen Supreme Court justices that so reliably fit into conservative or liberal boxes than we do today or in the last decade or so. So in the past, what I'm going to show you here is that in the past, presidents have nominated Supreme Court justices who it's very difficult sometimes to guess if they are going to vote liberally or conservatively in particular decisions. So in these two courts, you see a lot of justices who kind of fit in the middle, right? We can't peg them as liberal or conservative justices. But in the modern times, we really only have Justice Kennedy as this middle, we're not really sure if he's going to swing liberal or conservative. So it makes the court itself even more politicized than we traditionally think of it. So this is all to say that we have a perfect storm right now of high-stakes politics, and we're seeing it play out with the nomination of Merrick Garland. So Scalia was a reliably conservative justice, and his empty seat is reliably causing much strife between President Obama and the Republican-controlled Senate Judiciary Committee. But as we see in this photo, Obama is no fool, right? He's still going to go through the process of nominating someone to this post. And he realizes that it's going to be very difficult for him to get a nominee through this process that seems like they're going to disturb this liberal and conservative divide of the court, right? So he's not going to be able to nominate someone to the Supreme Court that looks as liberal as Obama might want that nominee to be. So as a result, Obama is going to nominate Merrick Garland. Merrick Garland is a judge who is seen to have a fairly centrist record. He comes from the federal judiciary, so if you are looking to make a case for an apolitical Supreme Court nominee, you typically are going to pick someone from the judiciary itself. And Garland has a pretty posh job already. He is the chief judge of the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals. And the D.C. Circuit is often considered the stepping stone to the Supreme Court. 3 of the current 8 justices on the Supreme Court have previously served on the D.C. Circuit courts. So Chief Justice John Roberts, Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and Justice Clarence Thomas have all sat on the court that Merrick Garland is currently the chief judge of. Justice Scalia was also a member of the D.C. Circuit before he was elevated to the Supreme Court. So Garland is a very smart pick for President Obama, and given his current position, if the nomination is unsuccessful, he has a pretty swanky job that he can return to, even if this doesn't work out in his favor. So why does this all matter, right? Why should we care about the nomination of Merrick Garland? So at this time, Republicans who are integral to the successful appointment of Merrick Garland are still opposed to giving Obama's nominee a fair shake, and they are dragging their feet in initiating the confirmation process. So when you are engaged in the confirmation process, there is a second step after, or many steps down the line, after the president nominates you, you have to fill out a questionnaire. And you can think of this as an incredibly exhaustive resume that you have to fill out to demonstrate all of the positions you've had in the past, all of your speaking engagements, and Merrick Garland's filled out questionnaire It's 142 pages long. And it includes such a level of detail as, I asked a question of a panel in the year 1984. I cannot imagine remembering every time I raised my hand at a conference or in a class, but this is the level of detail Merrick Garland has to put into this questionnaire that was provided for him. And the chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee, when he was asked if he intends to review the questionnaire, was, I've got plenty of reading to do, and I usually prioritize my reading from the standpoint of things that are imminent. All right. So while Garland doesn't seem to be a looming concern for Senator Grassley, just as many of you probably don't think a paper deadline is a looming concern until the day of, not looking at anyone in the audience here, there are actually 87 judicial vacancies that are currently pending in front of the Senate Judiciary Committee. 60 of those seats have nominees, and those nominees are still waiting for their confirmation processes to be resolved. Oh, I had this. So for example, in the state of Texas, where you have the highest number of judicial vacancies across the federal system, I really like this graphic, but it's actually 12 vacancies within the state of Texas right now, which is quite significant. So why should we care about judicial vacancies? Why should we care about this empty seat on the Supreme Court and these 87 empty seats across the judiciary? Well, at the Supreme Court level, it might be apparent why we care about a vacant seat. As I mentioned earlier, if we lose Scalia's reliable conservative vote, we are left with a 4-4 split on the Supreme Court. If we don't have at least 5 members in a majority at the Supreme Court, the case is effectively deemed to not set any kind of precedent, and a lower court's decision is effectively upheld. So the Supreme Court can't do anything if they don't have 5 people agreeing for a majority opinion. And without a full bench, the Supreme Court might actually be less inclined to affirmatively rule or to actually make a decision at all. So for example, a couple of days ago, the Supreme Court wrote an opinion in a case called Zubik v. Burwell. And in this decision, the court basically opted to not decide a case on the nature of the relationship between religious freedom and contraceptive rights. And because of that, we end up with a lack of national resolution on this policy area, right? They told the lower courts to sort of deal with this issue. Also, the pace of case acceptance for the next term is much, much slower than it usually is at this time in any other year. So this is another signal that the Supreme Court justices do not feel comfortable resolving legal issues without a full bench. So these are examples of how, without one justice on the Supreme Court and without just judges filling all of the seats at the lower levels of the federal judiciary, the judiciary's ability to move law forward and effectively resolve important questions that are important to not only the parties involved, but to all Americans is limited, and law is going to continue to be unresolved. Thank you.